Most people think fear begins when something appears, when a sound gets louder, when a shape steps into view. These stories didn't begin that way. Nothing arrived, nothing followed, nothing changed, at least not at first. The people you're about to hear from lived their lives normally, slept in familiar rooms, walked through familiar spaces. They weren't hiding, they weren't running. And that's what made it possible. Because the most unsettling truth wasn't that someone followed them, it was that no one ever needed to. There are true scary stories where people are followed, and then there are stories like these. These are true horror stories where the fear didn't come from being chased, threatened, or confronted. It came from realizing something far worse. The people in these unexplained true stories didn't notice anything unusual at first. No sudden noises, no obvious movement. Everything felt normal enough to ignore. What connects these stories isn't paranoia. It's hindsight. A moment where ordinary details suddenly aligned, sounds that had always been there, objects that seemed slightly out of place. These are true scary stories shared by people who only understood what was happening after everything made sense at once. Not because something appeared, but because nothing had ever left. Someone was watching the whole time. The person who shared this story didn't believe they were ever alone. They believed something worse. That nothing unusual had ever happened because nothing needed to. For years, the apartment felt ordinary. Quiet nights, familiar sounds, the kind of place where routines slowly replace awareness. At first, there was no fear, just a sense of mild discomfort that came and went. The feeling that a room had already been occupied moments before entering it. The instinct to pause in doorways without knowing why. These moments were brief enough to ignore and familiar enough to accept. Small details began to surface over time. Objects weren't missing, only adjusted. A cup turned slightly differently on the counter. A chair pulled out farther than usual. Each detail alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern that never quite reached the level of alarm. The sounds at night were the easiest to dismiss. A soft creak, a faint shift in another room. The kind of noise every building makes when no one is watching. The person learned which sounds belonged to the apartment and which ones could be ignored. That familiarity became a shield. The moment of realization didn't happen in darkness. It happened in full daylight. While cleaning, the person noticed something they couldn't explain away. Dust disturbed in narrow areas where no one ever stood. Footprints weren't visible, just absence. As if someone had been there long enough to leave nothing behind. Standing there, the memory of every small inconsistency returned at once. The sounds that stopped when acknowledged, the objects that shifted without disappearing. The feeling of awareness that never escalated into action. It didn't feel like something had arrived. It felt like something had been patient. That night, the apartment didn't feel more active. It felt settled, as if the realization itself had completed something. The silence carried weight. Every movement felt measured, not because something moved in response, but because nothing needed to. The person didn't search the apartment. They didn't call anyone. They stayed awake, sitting still, understanding that movement wasn't required to be noticed. The fear wasn't sharp, it was permanent. The next morning, they packed essentials and left, not out of panic, out of certainty. Some places don't become unsafe. They simply stop pretending to be empty. Looking back, the most unsettling part wasn't that someone had been watching. It was realizing how long it had been happening without ever needing to be seen. This story didn't begin with fear. It began with convenience, a place that felt neutral, temporary, easy to occupy without attachment. Being alone there wasn't unusual, it was expected. That assumption became the reason nothing felt wrong at first. The awareness arrived quietly, not as panic, but as interruption, a subtle pressure that made conversations pause and movements slow, the instinct to look up without knowing what was being checked for. Each time, the space appeared unchanged. Nights passed and the feeling returned at the same hour, always when the place was empty enough to notice silence. The person adjusted without realizing it, standing where visibility felt wider, keeping personal items close, leaving earlier than planned. The unsettling part wasn't the feeling itself. It was how easily it blended into routine. Awareness became background noise, something acknowledged but never confronted. The absence of escalation made it easier to stay. Confirmation came without warning. While waiting, the person noticed a reflection that didn't align with movement. Not a figure crossing, not a shadow passing, just a slight change that remained when attention shifted away. Turning around revealed nothing. No sound followed. No reaction occurred. That was when the understanding settled in. Whatever was watching didn't respond to observation. It didn't hide because it never needed to move. After that night, staying late felt impossible. Not because the space felt dangerous, but because it felt complete, like attention had fulfilled its purpose. Leaving didn't feel like escape. It felt like interruption. The strangest part came later. Once they stopped going there, the feeling vanished entirely, as if awareness was only required while they remained within view. They never returned to confirm it. Some realizations don't demand proof. They change behavior quietly and permanently. Leaving felt like the obvious solution. New address, new layout, new sounds to relearn. The person believed distance would dissolve whatever had formed. For the first few days it worked. The nights were quiet, sleep returned. The feeling faded enough to be doubted. The return wasn't sudden. It arrived as familiarity in the wrong place. A moment of stillness that felt too intentional. The same awareness from before, now detached from any recognizable source. The room was different, but the sensation was unchanged. At first, they dismissed it as memory, the mind repeating old habits, but the timing aligned too precisely. The same hour, the same heaviness in the air, the same instinct to remain motionless. Patterns don't usually survive relocation. This one did. What made this worse than before was the loss of structure. There was no room to avoid, no corner that felt neutral. The awareness didn't belong to the space. It appeared wherever attention lingered, as if observation itself had become an invitation. One night, without fully deciding to, they tested it. They stopped moving, stopped scanning, stopped avoiding the sensation. Instead of resisting it, they focused on it. The result wasn't relief. The awareness sharpened, as if focus completed a connection. There was no image, no sound, no confirmation that could be explained away. Only the certainty that attention had consequences. The realization settled in quietly. Whatever this was, it didn't follow people, it responded to them. From that point on, the person stopped trying to understand it, not because it disappeared, but because recognition seemed to give it form. Some fears grow louder when named. This one became clearer when acknowledged. Leaving again wasn't an option. There was nowhere to go. The problem had never been location. It had been awareness. Across these stories, nothing dramatic ever announced itself. No sudden movements, no voices calling out, no moments that demanded immediate escape. What unsettled the people involved was far quieter than that. A realization that didn't strike like fear, but settled slowly, reshaping how familiar spaces felt. None of them believed they were being hunted. There was no sense of pursuit. What connected their experiences was the understanding that something had been present without needing to act, watching without reacting, observing without interruption, as if attention itself was enough. In hindsight, the signs were always there. Small inconsistencies that never escalated, familiar sensations that never demanded explanation. Each detail was easy to ignore on its own. Together, they formed something clearer only after enough time had passed. What made these true scary stories difficult to forget wasn't what anyone saw, it was what they understood. That absence doesn't mean emptiness. That silence doesn't mean nothing is there, and that noticing something can be enough to change how it behaves. Fear didn't arrive as panic, it arrived as certainty. A quiet shift in perception where privacy stopped feeling guaranteed, where being alone became an assumption that could no longer be trusted. Some people don't become afraid because they realize they're being watched. They become afraid because they don't know when it started or how long it had been happening before they finally noticed. Once that realization settles in, fear doesn't peak. It stabilizes. It becomes something carried instead of something escaped. Places that once felt empty never feel that way again. Someone was watching the whole time.